Thank you everyone for joining us today. This is the December version of Park County Community Foundation's Nonprofit Network Series. Today we will be hearing from Nico Woodcose, talking to us about a bird's eye view of successful grant writing.
Okay, all right. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Thanks for joining. This is going to be a bird's eye view of successful grant writing. And as Barb already mentioned, my name is Dr. Nico Woodcose, and I'm going to start off by telling you a little bit of my own background and history with grant writing. So there's an old joke that says, how do you know if somebody has a PhD? Don't worry, they'll tell you. And that is certainly true in my case. I like to introduce myself that way with my formal title when I'm doing a presentation because I want to try and cultivate a level of ethos. I want you guys to believe that I'm a credible teacher. But I'm also going to go ahead and completely undermine my fancy degree to say I did not learn a single thing about grant writing in school. In fact, in terms of grant writing, I'm an autodidact, which means I'm completely self-taught. I first became interested in grant writing because I was a theater artist, and the creation of theatrical productions tends to require a bit of financial support without giving a whole lot of return. So I bought this book called The Artist's Guide to Grant Writing, and I think I probably got through the first few chapters before I started looking for and submitting for some grants. I definitely received a few rejection letters, but the first grant that I received was for $500 from the Illinois Art Council to create these little pamphlets. I had made the argument that since my artwork was ephemeral, I needed something that I could put into people's hands so that they would remember me and then they would book my shows. And I ordered so many of these pamphlets that 10 years later, with a different color hair and a different name even, I still have a whole box of them. But I started to really fall in love with the process of grant writing because it combined a lot of things that I was interested in and that I was good at. It involves analysis to figure out what it is that funders want. It involves storytelling, and it also involves persuasion. So when I relocated to Mammoth Hot Springs in 2017, right away, I started volunteering for the Electric Peak Arts Council. And I had mentioned to them that I enjoyed grant writing. Don't ever tell anybody that you enjoy grant writing unless you want to get ready to write a lot of grants. So pretty instantly, I became the chair of their grants committee. Then in January of 2018, I actually attended one of those in-person trainings that Barb was talking about. So PCCF put on a training that was called Funding Your Future. It was done by Kristen Galbraith. And after I did that particular training, honestly, it was all over. I felt like I really understood grant writing on a deeper level. And pretty quickly, I started being contacted by all sorts of local and non-local entities to write and consult on all kinds of grants. So pretty soon I started realizing that I was getting almost all of the grants that I was applying for, and I decided it might be time to start charging people a little bit of money for my services. So since about 2019, I have been working as a freelance grant writer and a nonprofit consultant, which works really great with having a summer job with the Park Service. So I can do that in the wintertime. And my biggest client has always been North Yellowstone Education Foundation based in Gardner. So not only do I write and manage all of their grants, but I also oversee, as Barb kind of mentioned, their Connect Grants Classroom Grants program. So I get to oversee the evaluation and distribution of grants, and getting to be on that other side of grant funding has really provided a lot of insight that I'm going to share with you today, and it's made me a better grant writer. So as the name of this workshop suggests, what we're really going to be looking at is a very broad overview of kind of everything that is involved with grant writing. And my primary goal is really to try and demystify the grant writing process and to empower you to write grants. So I kind of took it from the perspective of a beginner. So a lot of you might be really seasoned at grant writing, and some of this information will not be new to you, but it definitely never hurts to kind of brush up on the basics and kind of get back to, you know, the beginning of things. So it is going to be more like a beginner's mind. Additionally, since this is the nonprofit network series, I'm kind of taking for granted that you're going to be applying for grants from the perspective of a nonprofit organization. But even if you are an individual grant writer, kind of just trying to write grants for yourself, almost all of this information will still apply. So because we only have 45 minutes together with some time for questions at the end, our approach is definitely going to be pretty quick and dirty. But I do want you to be asking yourselves, where do I want to go deeper? Because if there are certain topics that you'd really want to dive in deeper or look at more extensively, there's the possibility that PCCF might be able to offer more trainings along that. I just want to take a second to make sure I'm not missing anything appropriate in the chat. Welcome, everybody. All right. Now I've lost the ability to advance my slides. Here we go. So let's just begin at the beginning with what is a grant? A grant is an award of money that allows you to do very specific things, usually according to very specific guidelines that are spelled out in painstaking detail and to which you must respond very clearly in your grant proposal. Now, I really like this definition by Ellen Karsh and Arlen Sue Fox because I feel like it kind of gets at the heart of what a grant is. A grant is a contract between two entities. An organization is going to give you money in exchange for doing a certain thing. So oftentimes folks will define a grant as free money. And it is free money in the sense that you don't have to pay it back, but it's money in exchange for creating a proposal, carrying out a project, documenting that project, and submitting that final report. So everybody wants free money, but not everyone actually wants to carry out a project. And I would wager to say that nobody ever wants to fill out the final report. So before you start dreaming up some wild idea just because you found a grant that might be able to pay for it, you might want to really ask yourself if it's worth it. If your organization is going to do a project, they're going to do it anyway, they're going to document it anyway, then definitely seek grant funding for it because that is essentially free money. But if you're going to go out of your way to kind of make up a project just because you think you can get the money to do it, you're probably going to spend more in time and effort on making that project than it would be worth it for just getting that free money, quote unquote. So who are our funders? Funders can be anybody that has money that they want to give away for a specific person. So this might be the federal government, state governments, local governments, community foundations, corporate foundations, resort tax areas, small businesses, private parties, and others. And I really want to emphasize that granting is a mutually beneficial process. So these various organizations, they've already given a lot of thought to their goals, and they need projects to be able to fulfill their mission. They need to be accountable to their supporters, and the way they're going to do that is by getting really strong projects that are realistic, that are going to get done, and receiving reports and documentation of those projects. So when you can fulfill that role, when you can carry that out, you're actually a crucial component in the philanthropic cycle. So definitely reframe your idea about grant writing. You're not begging for money. There's nothing to feel guilty about. You're actually helping these different organizations fulfill their mission. And if you can write your grant in a way that explains how you're helping them, then you're way more likely to get funded. So go ahead and grow your grant writing ego and realizing that you're actually doing a good service when you write and fulfill a grant. So as I mentioned, you really want to try and kind of organically figure out your projects and programs and then seek out grant funding that's going to fit with those programs. It's not advisable to just go looking for grants and then after the fact try and find programs or make up programs that are going to fit it. So probably, I know a lot of these organizations that I'm familiar with that are in the group today are pretty established. Probably you already have some of your project and programming areas figured out. So for each one of those that you think you might want to get grant funding, you're going to want to take a minute to ask yourself if the project is fundable. So you want to ask yourself, is this project feasible? Is it something your community needs? Will it have a measurable impact that you can track? Is it photogenic? Meaning, is it going to produce some really cute photos of like little kids on skis or something really happy and touchy-feely that your grant funders can later use in their marketing materials? You want to ask, does it have a clear beginning and end? And will the project ultimately be sustainable? Is there a way for this grant funding to sort of get it off the ground, but once it's off the ground, it can keep going? Now, you do not have to be able to say like 100% yes to every single one of these questions, but you do want more yeses than nos. And you do want to be able to make a case for kind of all of these areas. Now, if you do have a lot of no's or you can't make that case, it doesn't mean it's a bad program. It just means maybe you're going to want to look for a different way to fund that program, like through individual donations or fundraising event or other sources of revenue. It just means it might not be worth your time and effort to write a grant for a program if you can't kind of say yes to several of these questions. Now you might be asking, what about general operating support? What if I just want to write a grant to get some general operating support for my organization? I'm not trying to fund a very specific project. Yes. Any kind of unrestricted funding, general operating support, we all want that. It's amazing. It's the unicorn of the grant writing world, and it definitely does exist. You can find it. It doesn't exist probably as often as we would like. The majority of the opportunities you're going to find are going to be more specific project focused. But what's interesting is that when you do find the opportunity to apply for general operating support, the questions of the grant are not going to change. The questions for the grant are still going to be kind of project based. So what you need to do in that case is you have to think about all the work that your organization does as kind of like one big project. So the entire mission of your organization, think of it as like a concrete project, and you're still going to kind of ask yourself these same questions, and you're still going to sell it to a granting organization in kind of a project-based way. So in that instance, you're asking yourself, are all of your programs feasible? Is the mission of your organization responding to community needs? Will all of your programs have measurable impacts that you can track? Are your programs photogenic? Do they have clear beginnings and endings? And will your specific programs or even will your organization as a whole be sustainable? All right, now let's talk a little bit about grant readiness. So before you even have a specific proposal in mind, it's a really great idea to start gathering up everything that you're going to need to apply for grants. You're probably going to want to apply for multiple grants for any specific programming area. And furthermore, by gathering some of this stuff together, by getting some of this information, kind of nailing down some of these early details, it'll actually make it easier for you to suss out if a specific grant opportunity is going to be the right fit for your program. So I definitely recommend spending a little time on preparing your grant packet before you even necessarily start trying to find grant opportunities. So preparing your grant packet is going to involve a little bit of writing. It's going to involve some research, and it's going to involve some gathering of documents. So let's talk first about the writing part. You're going to want to brainstorm the following about any program that you want to try and seek grant funding for. You're going to want to come up with a project description, which is a simple, concise explanation of your project. You're going to want to come up with some goals and objectives, what your project will accomplish in broad ways and also specific ways. You're going to want to have a statement of need, which is what is that problem that your project is going to be addressing. And finally, you're going to want to have a statement of impact. What influence will this have on your community? Now, don't worry, this is kind of just like early brainstorming round. We are going to dig deeper into every single one of these categories a little bit later in the presentation, but just knowing this much, you should be able to have a sentence or two for every single one of those before you even start looking into grant applications. All right, the research part about completing your grant packet. This is going to involve gathering any data or statistics that you can find to support the claims that you're going to make. This can be stuff like demographic info, median income in your area, number of people below the poverty line. What's relevant to your work is going to vary widely depending on what exactly it is you're doing. But any kind of hard data, hard facts that you're going to be able to sprinkle into your application is going to make you more credible. It's going to appeal to the logical side of our brain. So you want to start kind of gathering and piecing together some of those facts so you can easily grab them when it's time to put your application together. A great place to turn to try and get some of that information is the We Will Park County portal, where they gather information across these 5 areas: health, safety, and education, economic performance, housing and affordability, small town and rural lifestyle, and landscapes and natural beauty. I'll also point out that there's a great nonprofit network series presentation called Using Data to Tell Your Best Story by McLaren Lotta. I'm going to link to that at the end of this presentation. And that has a lot of really great resources for places where you can search all kinds of information, exactly what I'm talking about. All right, now we come to the gathering documents part. Every grant application is going to ask for a list of attachments at the end. Oftentimes when I'm working with clients, they start working on the grant at the beginning and they maybe haven't even got all the way to the bottom of it. And I just want to encourage you not to save this attachment part for the very end, because it can take a surprisingly long time to get together everything that they need. Some applications are only going to ask for a few things. Some are going to ask for, 10 different things that you need to get your hands on. You're probably going to need to edit PDFs, combine them. You're going to have to compress them. It can be kind of a painstaking process to get all of those documents organized and uploaded into a grant portal. So it's not recommended to wait until the very end. There is a free program called PDF SAM that you can use to do some of these different activities that you need to do to your PDFs if you don't have it. Now, another great nonprofit network presentation was called Grant Readiness for Funding Success by the Dotted I. So if you want to learn more about that, I'm going to link to that at the end as well. And here is the grant readiness checklist that the Dotted I put together. They're a grant writing firm based out of Bozeman. And I use this checklist that they put together myself when I'm putting together grants. I will say that this is extremely comprehensive. You probably do not need to gather every single element on their list before you get started. I would focus on the left-hand side of the screen where it has the must-haves. And again, I will link a downloadable copy of this checklist at the end of the presentation. It's very helpful. You want to start gathering all of that stuff, put it in a Google folder or a desktop folder, and just make sure that you are starting to have some of these materials ready. Okay, now that you've started to put together your grant packet, you're probably ready and maybe even a little anxious to start looking for actual grant opportunities that you're going to apply for. So here are the 4 steps that I use when I'm trying to search for grants. I always start with Google. So you can start by making a list of about 10 keywords or phrases that describe your project and or your organization, and simply plug these into the search bar with the words funding or grants. It's also really helpful if you limit it by geography. So adding the word Montana, if you're Montana based, or Wyoming, if you're Wyoming based, or even the name of a city, the name of a county, anything you can kind of do and play around with it to try and get some of the results that you want. At this point in your process, you're just going to want to kind of quickly scan anything that looks like it might be promising. And if it does seem like it's a good fit, go ahead and put it on a list for later. Next, you can start researching similar organizations. So if you know of another organization that's doing the same kind of work that you're doing, or if there's an organization that's already completed a similar kind of project to what you're working on, you can try and find their annual report, or even just poke around on their website and try to see like who funded them. A lot of times, if an organization funded a similar organization or a similar project, that might mean that they can be a good fit for you. You can definitely reach out to some of these organizations, especially if they're like a similar organization that's not going to be competing with you for that same funding. Then they are usually very helpful and happy to talk with you. They can answer questions about different organizations that they've applied to in the past. And they might say no, but it never really hurts to try and network with people and make contacts. So again, through this step number 2, if you come up with anything that looks really promising, go ahead and add it to your list. And then third, you can use grant databases. This is stuff like GrantStation, GrantWatch, Instrumental, grants.gov. A lot of you nonprofit organizations may already have some kind of subscription to one of these grant databases. Grants.gov is free, but all the rest of these ones require a fee. I actually get most of my grant opportunities that I find from talking with other nonprofits and from using Google. I think grant databases can be really great. If you already subscribe to one, you should definitely utilize that resource, but I do not think it's crucial, especially if you're a nonprofit or an individual on a tight budget. I don't think it's like do or die for finding grants. In fact, I kind of find grant databases to be a little bit cumbersome. I don't find them especially intuitive to use. Grants.gov, which is free, which is how you can look up all federal grants. Before you even go to that website, I would say pack your patience, because it's just like a 90s HTML website that's not super intuitive. And what happens a lot with grant databases is you get just a lot of results. So you think, I want education grants in Montana, and then you get all these results, which seems really exciting and promising. But the reality is you're going to have to comb through every one of them. And probably 95% of them are not going to be a right fit for one reason or another. And that's going to be kind of true about just looking for grant opportunities in general. It's a lot of no's to find that really great yes. So by going through those first 3 steps, you probably will have generated a list of different opportunities that you want to look into further. And the way you're going to look into them further is you want to spend a little time looking deeply at each call for proposals put out for a grant, and also especially at the organization itself. So at this point in the process, you really want to study the mission statement of a given organization. You want to try and figure out what kind of projects they typically fund, what geographical location they typically fund, what size are their grants? Is it they only fund up to $5,000, or their minimum grant application is $25,000. That's going to make a big difference for how you approach it and how it fits with your needs. You can look up their 990 tax forms, which are public access. You can use the website Candid to do that. Candid does have a fee to use their grants database, but to look up their 990s and to look up different foundations on there, it's free. You do just have to make a free account. And then honestly, best case scenario, if there lists a contact information for a granting organization, if there's an email address there or a phone number, you really should try to reach out. A lot of times they will be willing to have a conversation with you, and that can really help both parties determine if this is going to be a good fit. So they don't want to get bad grant applications, and you don't want to submit a bad grant application. Okay, so now we're going to talk about reading your request for proposals. So now that you've identified some grant applications that you really are feeling good about, you want to apply for, you want to read really closely in the request for proposals, kind of like it's reconnaissance work. You want to really try to read between the lines and dig in there for what they're really going for. And what I like to do is print out any kind of request for proposals, even mission statement, and I bust out my Lucky Grant highlighter, which I have right here, and I'm looking for buzzwords in this document, which I will pull out and copy into a document that I'll save for later. So here's an example of how that works. I recently had the opportunity to consult on a grant that the Gateway Hose Company in Gardner wrote to the Federal Emergency Management Agency for a new fire engine. And so this is just one paragraph from the FEMA website for the specific grant that we were applying for. When I read through this paragraph, as well as all the materials related to the grant, these are kind of the buzzwords that I highlighted and pulled out. Enhancing the safety of the public and firefighters, equip and train emergency personnel, enhance operational efficiencies, foster interoperability, and support community resilience. So just bookmark this. We're going to come back to it a little bit later in the process. So you want to find these buzzwords and kind of set them aside for later. By now, you're finally ready to start writing your grant. And as Jackson-based author Tina Welling writes, she says, lower your standards and keep lowering them until the flow begins. Those nasty judges in our heads don't belong there until the very end when it's time to edit and rewrite. So when you're writing your grant, you want to assume that your audience knows nothing. You want to be specific and concrete, and you want to write so your mother can understand it, which is just another way of saying you don't really want to use a lot of jargon. So now we're going to revisit that brainstorming list from earlier and talk a little bit more in depth about each part of it. So you're going to want a project description, and here you're going to describe what exactly you plan to do and when you plan to do it. And you want to be as detailed and concrete as you can. It's definitely better to slightly modify a proposal later than to come across at this point like you're unsure about how something's going to happen. You're also going to want to draft your statement of need, or sometimes this is called a statement of problem. So you're asking, what is the problem that your project seeks to address? Why is your project needed? Why is it needed right now? Why is the need urgent? Why is your organization suited to tackle this problem? What would happen if this problem is not addressed? And why is grant funding from this specific organization the way to get it done? Now let's talk for a minute about your goals and objectives. So most grant applications are going to say, give us your goals and objectives. Goals and objectives are interrelated, but slightly different. Goals are general intentions. They tend to be intangible, abstract. They can't necessarily be validated. They define the ultimate purpose of the project. And some of the words associated with goals are to know, to understand, to gain, to appreciate. Objectives, on the other hand, are precise intentions. They're tangible, they're concrete, they can be evaluated or measured. They use specific action verbs. And some of the words associated with objectives are define, recognize, identify, illustrate, develop, and synthesize. Now, each one of your goals should directly correspond to an objective. So here's an example from a grant application that I put together for last year's PCCF cycle for the North Yellowstone Education Foundation. So for our goals and objectives, I'll just read the first one off. But so goal number one was to solidify Connect Grants as a community-driven, community-funded, and community-evaluated program. Objective number one, to provide $20,000 in Connect grant funding supporting 6 to 10 diverse projects. So right there you can see goal number one and objective number one go together. And if you read down those other goals and objectives, you'll see they're also linked, right? So you can see they correspond. And all your goals and objectives should ultimately support your mission, right? And sometimes you have to go right ahead and spell that out. So in that same grant question, I also added, these goals and objectives are designed to work with the Gardner community to build sustainable support for Gardner Public Schools, thus enhancing educational and wellness opportunities and furthering NYEF's mission. So it never hurts to be just crystal clear as you can. All right, then once you have your goals and objectives, you can really use that to kind of steer your statement of impact. You're asking, what positive change will your project create? How will you know if your project has succeeded? And what measurable outcomes can you collect to make sure that you're on the right track as you're doing your project? Okay, so now we're going to go back to that list that we generated before, talking about when you're reading over materials for an organization or the request for proposals, you want to go through and you want to have a list of buzzwords. I keep my list of buzzwords pasted right at the top of the grant application that I'm working on, and I try to fill them in as I'm going. I also go back and try to fill them in after the fact. If you haven't generated enough buzzwords, if you want to double check, you can always read back over any materials that are associated with a grant application. So this is the example that I gave you. These are the buzzwords that I pulled out just out of this one paragraph. And so for this presentation, I went ahead and opened that grant application and I just ran a quick search for every one of these terms. And I can tell you from that the word safety appears 17 times in my application. The word train appears 5 times and equipment appears 15 times. Phrases like operational efficiencies and operational performance appear 3 times. Interoperability appears twice, and the word community appears 19 times. Now, I can assure you that I do not naturally use phrases like operational efficiency and interoperability. I went ahead and included them on purpose because I could tell from reading this call for proposals that these terms were going to be important to the people evaluating my grant. And I'm also very happy to report that Gateway Hose Company was awarded this FEMA grant for almost $500,000 to purchase a new fire engine. All right, now we're going to talk about your short project description. Now, very often when you're writing a grant, the very first question right at the top, just after they ask you your contact information, it's going to ask you for a short project description. I want you to skip that question, answer all the other questions, and come to your short project description dead last, because by now you know your project inside and out, you know the intricacies of your project. So this short project description is your elevator pitch. This very well may be the only thing that a potential funder reads. They might read this and say, nope, this project's not for me, or yes, this project absolutely is for me, based on this one teeny tiny paragraph. So it's not a throwaway question. It should be potent and meticulously crafted, and it should deeply and accurately depict your project. So save this for last and spend a little time on it. Make it really good. All right, now we're going to talk a little bit about your project budget. So every grant application out there is going to request a budget, and this is going to have 2 parts to it. It's going to need to list all of your expenses related to the project, at all of your income related to the project. And so I want to encourage you to think big when you're looking at what your expenses are and what your income is, right? So very often I'll be evaluating grant applications and it'll be asking for example, $500 for books. That's the only expense. And the only source of income is this $500 grant. But in reality, when I learned a little bit more about the program, I found out that these books were a larger part of a whole curriculum program that the school already purchased. And these books were just supplementary literature for that program, right? So it would have been a much more compelling application if that total budget was a little bigger and it showed us the money that the school already invested, all the other different items that have already been paid for and bought, and then it had other sources of income as well. Most grant funders are not going to want to be your only source of income. They're going to want you to show other sources of funds, and that's going to be more compelling to them. It kind of shows that, like, it demonstrates your integrity a little bit, and it just kind of makes your application just look a little bit better. And so, but you might be like, but this is my only source of revenue for this project. It might not be, right? So definitely think about any other sources of income that might be contributed to the program. You might have other pending grants. Even if they're pending, you can list them. You might have individual donations or event revenue. And you also can count in-kind donations, right? So are you volunteering your time to make this program? Is your board an all-volunteer board? Has the venue for this program been donated? Have materials for this program been donated? If you can kind of assign the realistic approximate cost to those donations, then that counts as income toward your project. And that's going to make your budget look a little nicer and a little bit better for grant funders to approve. So you want your budget to be realistic. You don't want to, lowball yourself. You want to ask for the right amount of money that you need, but you also want to be reasonable. You want to be within the appropriate range for what that grantor typically gives. Sometimes they'll list that, sometimes they won't. And sometimes you kind of have to ask them for that information or dig it out from their 990. And ultimately, you want your budget to be just really neat and organized. So sometimes they'll give you a template to use, sometimes they won't. Doesn't have to be fancy, it just has to be organized. All right, so now we're going to talk about my personal tips for successful grant writing that I've put together over 10 years of writing grants, and these are my own favorite things to talk about. I could do a whole presentation just on this part. All right, number one, never compose your grant in the online form. So nowadays, most grants are going to direct you to some kind of online portal that's going to give you a little text box for each question. Do not write the grant in the online form, okay? What you want to do is you want to get to those grant questions and you want to copy and paste them into a workable Google Doc or Word doc or any other usable document. Otherwise, when you submit that grant application, sometimes they don't even give you the chance to download it. You put it in the portal and it just goes poof out into the ether, and then you don't even have a copy of your own grant that you wrote. Even if you can download a copy of it, it's going to be in PDF format and it's not going to be really easy for you to work with later on. You're going to want to have that later on. And also, it doesn't make it really easy for you to edit it or get feedback from other people. So go ahead and just copy it into a Google Doc or a Word doc. You're also going to want to break down your questions into sub-questions so that you can answer every single part of every single question. Okay, so a little bit ago, I referenced that goals and objective question from the PCCF application from last year. So here up at the top, I'm showing the way the question was listed and asked in the actual grant application. And below, I'm showing the way that I wrote the question for myself in my own working document, right? So a lot of times in a grant, they will rattle a bunch of questions off together. And very frequently, applicants don't answer them all. They start answering the first part of the question and they don't really get into every single question that was asked. You know, when we're evaluating grants, we need those answers. We need to get every single question answered from you. So what I do is I break them apart, I answer every single question, and then I clump it all together to fill into the online form. All right, be meticulous with your file names. Tip number 3. Now, I want you to imagine that you're a grant evaluator. You're going to get 100 different grant applications for a specific round. All the attachments are coming through. You have to download them onto your computer. And let's say 75 of them have named their project budget. It's not going to be convenient for them. You want to make life as convenient for your evaluators as possible, because if they're happy, they're more likely to approve you and give you money. So you want to make sure that the name of your organization always comes at the very beginning of your file name. You want to make sure all of your attachments are using the same file name format. And finally, you're going to want to make sure that you know the name of your project, and you always use your project name the same way every time that you talk about your project. All right. Tip number 4, use a thesaurus. Okay, avoid using the same words over and over again. It's boring to read. You can use a thesaurus to make your writing sound more interesting. Personally, I like thesaurus.com. So for example, I say support all the time because I want your support and I'm supporting the community. So instead of saying support, you can try to use words like bolster, reinforce, uphold, be a foundation for. You want to lie to yourself about deadlines. You never want to wait till the last minute because something can always go wrong. So go ahead and push a deadline back on your own calendar, push it back even further for anybody who's sending you materials. You want to, next tip, you want to save easy tasks for when you don't have the brain power to write. So actually crafting your narratives and your project descriptions, it takes a certain amount of brain energy. I definitely like to write like first thing in the morning, first cup of coffee, that's my best brain. So if I have to work in the evening or another time when I know my brain isn't going to be firing on all cylinders, I use that time to format my PDFs or update my file names or copy and paste statistics into my document. I can do stuff that doesn't take a huge amount of mental energy. So like even when I was working on this presentation here, there were some times when I was just downloading bird photos, right? It doesn't take a lot of mental energy, but it still needs to get done. Okay, and my final tip is to start your final report on day 1. As soon as you get approved for your grant, you want to have that final report in mind, which is a great transition to my next slide. So actually getting approved for a grant is just the beginning. Once you have the funding, you actually have to carry out the project and document and track everything. Nice final reports make happy funders. Happy funders are more likely to fund you again. And it's always a great idea to document everything for your organization because you want to champion your own work as well. So as you're implementing your program, you want to be sure to track how the money was spent. You want to save all your invoices and receipts. You want to track the number of people impacted by your program, the types of people impacted by your program. You want to get photographs of your project in action and photo release forms for people who appear in the photos. You might want to try and get an impact story from a participant or even somebody who helped put on the program, some kind of story that illustrates how your program was successful. And if possible, you really want to also get a quote, like almost like a little bite-sized impact story that you can use. And finally, you're going to want a final budget that gives us a big picture of how financially your project went down. So in conclusion, grant writing is a mutually beneficial process where grant seekers help funders fulfill their mission. Grant writing involves reading very closely and choosing your words carefully. So if you are passionate, patient, and fastidious, grant writing might be perfect for you. Again, my name is Dr. Nika Wood-Koss. This is my contact info. I am nerdily passionate about grants, so if you ever want to chat with me, I definitely encourage you to reach out. And here is a list of additional resources. Here are all of the different previous nonprofit network programs that I referenced in this workshop, a list of helpful websites, and then on the final page is works cited, some additional works cited that I used to create this program. And with that, I will take a bow and open it up for questions. If anybody has anything they would like to ask, any burning questions.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, photogenic is not necessarily a requirement. It's just helpful. So I guess what you can ask yourself is, when you're telling your story about your grant, can the funders picture it? Right? And if you've ever been involved, so a lot of grant or a lot of nonprofit work is really in the communication sector. So like if you've ever yourself been putting together a newsletter or an annual report or a social media post or anything like that, you're probably like, gosh, I need a photo. I need a great photo of my organization's work in action. And so when an organization gives out grants, part of what they want to get back are photos that they can use in their marketing materials. That's not the only reason, but that's one thing that's going to be on their mind that they hope to ultimately gain from that process. So if your project is going to do something that's going to be able to take is going to be able to produce a photo that then they can later put in their annual report, that's thumbs up on your application. That just earns you a little bit of extra brownie points.